Hello, I'm Ian Campbell from Palliative Care Australia. Welcome to Thursdays at 3, conversations with people living and working at the end of life. Whether you're someone who works in palliative care, have a loved one going through palliative care, are living through grief and bereavement in your own life, or whether you're someone who's living with a life-limiting illness, or perhaps you're someone who's just keen to engage more in one of society's big last taboos, death and dying, then I hope there's something for you in this conversation that we're about to have. Welcome. Thanks so much for being here. And today we share the wisdom and the work of Rachel Coughlin, a palliative care physiotherapist and researcher. G'day, Rachel. Nice to have your company this afternoon. Thank you.
Hello, Ian. Thanks for having me.
Through the Centre for Humanitarian Leadership at Deakin University, Rachel is exploring the delivery of palliative care during times of emergency and crisis with a focus on armed conflict, war zones. And she's just returned from Gaza in the Middle East as part of her work and part of her research. When she's back home in Victoria, Rachel works as a palliative care physiotherapist at Calvary Healthcare in Melbourne and is also a board director here at Palliative Care Australia. Lots to talk about, Rachel, especially your recent trip to Gaza, but let's start at the start. I think when people think about palliative care, they see nurses and doctors, not necessarily physiotherapists. How did you come to combine physiotherapy and palliative care? How did it start for you?
Good question. Because it's not, as you say, it's not something that we always associate with allied health and with physiotherapy. Palliative care certainly, back when I trained as a physiotherapist, wasn't something that was part of our undergraduate training. Mm-hmm. And I guess a couple of things. In some ways, I fell into it. In some ways, I had always had a passion, I think, for aged care, for people living with disability, for people with life-limiting conditions. When I was at university, I funded my way through university through working at an aged care facility as a carer and also at some supported accommodation for people with disabilities. And I graduated from my came-out checkout chick job to those, and so I think developed a strong passion at that time for working with people with disability and with vulnerabilities. But then when I set out on my physio career, once I had graduated, I was living and working in London, and I found myself suddenly working with a huge number of people who were living with motor neurone disease. And I guess I developed a strong passion for MND. And as many people will know, MND, and I think as you spoke with Professor Samar last week, yes. A progressive neurological condition for which there is no cure, and people will end up on a palliative care pathway with MND. So I then ended up working for the Motor Neurone Disease Association in London and became very passionate about palliative care. And I had a very privileged experience when I was sort of trying to further my expertise in palliative care generally, and as a physio when I was at a multi-professional day at St Christopher's Hospice in London. Which was
right, the home of palliative care in many respects.
Palliative care, Dame Cicely Saunders's initiative, and where she worked and where she spent her last days and died. And I just happened to be at this multi-professional training day for palliative care on the day that Dame Cicely died in the very hospice that I was at. So I think that was a sign and a calling that this was a really important area of work to be in, and that what a privilege to be there on that particular day.
Palliative care is all about maximising the quality of life for as long as possible. Give us a sense of your work as a physiotherapist in empowering that quality of life. How do you help people? How does that art of physiotherapy help someone with a life-limiting illness?
I like that you put it as an art, because I think it is, because I think there's I think that's what draws me most to physiotherapy and palliative care, because we obviously have, we have a certain evidence base around the support of physical symptoms and pain, whether that's helping somebody with their movement and their mobility, their physical mobility, or supporting somebody who may be very short of breath or have severe breathlessness or dyspnea, whether it's alleviating pain through things like massage and movement and maintaining range of motion of joints and muscles. That's the physical stuff. But I think for me, the most important role that I play as a palliative care physio is helping somebody to maintain independence as long as possible, to ensure that they are maximising their quality of life till the end. But that everything that we do and plan around palliative care physio is related to that person's particular goals, no matter how small those goals might be. So when I work, say particularly when I'm working in the hospice setting and working with people who may be coming fairly close to the end of life, one of the things that I will always chat to a patient about is, and their family, is whether they would like to go outside and get some fresh air. And you so often find that people may have spent many weeks, potentially months, in an acute hospital setting, may have come to palliative care, and may not have had fresh air for a very, very long time. And just helping somebody, whether it's helping them into a wheelchair or helping them to walk outside in whatever way or form that takes, can just do so much for a person's spiritual health and psychological health. So for me, that's really the crux of what we do. It's goal-centered. It's focusing on what are even the small things that we can be providing for somebody to help them with their quality of life.
You must have had some amazing experiences and met some great people along the way in providing this service to people. Do you mind sharing some of those experiences that you've had along the way that sort of highlight the power of your work?
Yeah, so many stories, and I think every story is in many ways humbling and a privilege. I guess one that springs to mind immediately is an experience I had on our palliative care ward, where I walked into a patient's room as the physio and came across my high school principal, who I hadn't seen for 20 plus years. In fact, the last time I would have seen her was my last day of year 12, and it happened to be her last day at our high school after 10 years. And it was a beautiful moment of being able to give something back to somebody who had taught me so much. And we had a wonderful chat and some wonderful banter about all the naughty things that we had done in our time at high school and all the times she had told us off, and all the beautiful moments we had experienced. And we had these conversations while I was introducing her to this new concept for her of a 4-wheel walking frame, to help her be able to walk outside for the last time. But what was most, I suppose what I got most out of that was not the walking frame, but it was the conversation and just this really beautiful experience of encountering this person that had once been such a massive part of my life.
What do you take from those sort of experiences into your own life about life and death and living? How has your work shaped your approach to your own life, to your family's life?
Well, that's a big question, eh?
I know. I just thought that's a really unfair question, Rachel.
Yeah. I think it makes you grateful for every moment. I think it has, all of these experiences have helped me to perhaps slow down and to leave space for quiet times and space for conversation. And I guess one of the big things that my palliative care, like the practical experiences, have done for me is understand the power of story and the power of narrative. And I have certainly brought that a lot into my home life and into, I don't know, just how it shaped everything that I do, really. I've started writing a lot since I got more involved in palliative care. It's a long-winded answer.
Not at all. Not at all. It's something for us all to keep thinking about. Your work as a physiotherapist, I guess, highlights that team approach to palliative care. I mentioned the doctors and nurses, and they're critical parts of our approach and delivery of palliative care. Physiotherapists and other allied health professionals are also part of that team approach, that holistic approach to palliative care. Can you give us a sense of perhaps some of the other people, some of the other allied health professionals who might be involved in someone's palliative care experience?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we work with, certainly in my work in Melbourne, and a setting like Gaza is very different, and I can talk to that in a moment. But I guess we work with a huge range of allied health professionals from we work very closely with occupational therapists, dietitians, speech therapists, music therapists, pet therapists. I guess there's a huge multidisciplinary team in terms of allied health that plays a really important role in supporting somebody to maximise their quality of life. I'd also add to that, though, the people that we don't often think about, but are still not necessarily part of the professional allied health team, but are still so much a part of the team and a part of supporting a person living with a life-limiting illness, like the cleaners on the hospital ward, or the chefs, or the cooks in the kitchen, or the volunteers that come and deliver morning tea, the people that have these constant interactions with patients and family members, and just play such an important part of the role. I think certainly in a clinical setting. But then equally at home, all of the the social support systems and networks that people have around them, I think we always have to remember a part of a palliative care team as well.
All those little bits and pieces that go together to make a life and build a quality of life. We've all got a role to play. And I guess, would I be right in saying that I guess the people that are needed in that team are certainly inspired by the needs of the patient and the family?
Yeah, absolutely. So we work closely as a team and have, we're very good in palliative care, I think, very good at having multidisciplinary team meetings, but we would always make sure that we're involving the patient and the family in those meetings and in those discussions, to make sure that all that we do is very much centred around that person and their family's goals and wants and wishes for their time remaining. I think we often have to balance what we may advise or have been taught from a professional perspective with what that patient and their family really want. I guess a little example of that is a person living with cancer who I encountered not that long ago, who had she had trouble walking and had quite poor balance, but her number one goal was to be able to get back to her little plot of land and tend to her garden. So I think, if we purely looked at that from a clinical perspective, we might say, well, actually, you don't have the balance to do that anymore. You'll just fall over. But it's about finding ways that we can make that happen. And if that's working with the other allied health professionals to enable that to happen, then that's what I think our core business is.
Let's move on to your research work. Where did you combine the idea of palliative care and war zones? How did that come to connect for you? You've just been to Gaza, I guess, studying the delivery of palliative care in a war zone, in a conflict zone. How did that first thought come together for you?
So a convoluted pathway, I think, but if I was to try and pinpoint a moment, and it has been a kind of a long trajectory over a couple of decades, really, of coming to this research now. But if I could pinpoint a moment, it was when I was actually working for the Motor Neurone Disease Association in London,
Mm-hmm.
and I wasn't working as a physio. I was a care advisor, and we have a similar model here in Australia, support coordinators, care advisor role, whose job it is to look after that person and their family and signpost them to different health and social care services.
Mm-hmm.
So I was referred a man who was from South Sudan, that was at the time experiencing war, as it is still now. And he was living in London by himself, and he was there illegally. So he didn't have a visa to be there, and he was working as a taxi driver, getting cash in hand to send remittances home to his family in
Mm-hmm.
South Sudan. He was diagnosed with motor neurone disease, and he faced this very difficult decision of whether he would stay in London for the period of his illness until his death, without any family support. His family couldn't come to him. They didn't have visas to come to the UK. And he would have had very basic health services and some social services, but limited given his visa status. Or he could go home and receive very limited healthcare home in his war-torn country. So this we helped to support him, and he came to the decision that what was most important for him was to go home and be with his family, knowing that he wouldn't have that health and social care support, the health support around him, but he would have his family and social care. And I think for me that that sparked a passion for humanitarian work, and here I am combining the two. I think that's probably the point that set me on a path, even though the path has come about a bit of a long-winded way.
What have you learned so far? I mean, the delivery of any sort of healthcare in that sort of setting is a challenge, let alone trying to give a quality of life to people at the end of their life in that sort of setting. What have you learned so far from your research? Another big question. Sorry, Rachel.
100,000-word thesis, if you know. So yeah, if I could pick out a couple of key things, I guess when I embarked on my PhD looking at palliative care in conflict settings, I had to come up with a research question, as we all do in a big PhD or piece of research, and I deliberately kept that research question very broad, because what I had found in sort of preliminary discussions with experts in palliative care and experts in humanitarianism, and very often you don't find experts in both, was that opinions differed so much on what would be most important for palliative care in a humanitarian setting, and that people would come with their own biases, their own preconceived ideas, their own expertise, their own clinical expertise on what palliative care should look like in such a setting. So I embarked on this research in Gaza with a very broad question to try and understand and learn from them, rather than saying, how do we implement palliative care in your setting?
Yeah, right.
Much more, what does care of the seriously ill and dying look like in this context already?
Mm-hmm.
What are current ideas around suffering in illness? death and dying, how they currently support those who are seriously ill and dying, and how do they think the future of palliative care might look in this particular context. And then, only then can we try and understand, well, how might we try and support that.
Mm-hmm. How have you seen the residents and the communities of Gaza respond to that, their friends and family at the end of their life? What have you learned from the people of Gaza around their approach to palliative care and supporting their loved ones?
Yeah. So I think that's the thing with this work. I've learned so much more than the sort of the information that I could impart to them. I suppose the key things for me are that in a context like Gaza, and I think you touched on this with Professor Samar last week when she was talking about her context of Lebanon.
Yeah.
In a context like Gaza, there are so many valuable assets and aspects of palliative care that already exist, even if they don't call it palliative care.
Yeah.
And as Professor Samar had said, a lot of that is around this idea that compassionate communities already exist. They're collective cultures. Family and community will do the bulk of caring in serious illness and dying. And that's something that really, if we're talking about improving palliative care services in a context like Gaza, we need to be supporting that and highlighting that and not detracting from that. That's not to say that all of these other things, like making sure that pain relief and morphine is available and all of the important advocacy that goes around pain relief availability, I think we need. Sometimes we often go in with a kind of deficits approach and think what does not exist, rather than saying, well, actually, there are some really beautiful aspects of caring that do exist, and how can we harness that to a level where everybody is well supported in their illness and in their death. And I think when I spoke to a huge number of healthcare professionals in Gaza, and they were both Gazan and expatriate humanitarian workers, overwhelmingly there was a response that whilst we don't call it palliative care, a lot of what we do could be considered components of palliative care. That people are not abandoned, that compassionate care exists, that multidisciplinary care exists. They do have allied health workers who will rally around and support a person alongside their family. And so I think, we just always need to be mindful of different cultures and contexts have different ways of caring for their own. And we in the Western world, in our biomedical concepts and models of palliative care, have a lot that we can learn, as well as things that we can offer.
The power of strong communities just shines through again, and the strength that brings to individuals, but also to us as a society, just shines out again from your experience in Gaza. Gaza has dominated our news for so long, for many decades. What was it like being there?
It is at once heartbreaking and uplifting, and it's very hard. It's very hard to describe that succinctly. The Palestinian people have a concept called peso-optimism, which was first coined by a Palestinian author and playwright, Emil Habibi, who spoke about this idea of peso-optimism, that they constantly live in this tussle of being pessimistic because of the situation in which they find themselves in war, under occupation, under blockade, with very few rights and freedoms, and few health rights. But at the same time, they are extraordinarily optimistic that things will get better and there will be a hope for a better future. And so when you're there, that concept of optimism is just palatable.
Yep.
In many ways, you see very clearly those injustices and the impacts that acute waves of conflict and war have on people, and the extent to which that erodes people's resilience over time, because it's ongoing and it seemingly has no end. At the same time, people are hospitable, beautiful, welcoming, and they live on this little slice of the Mediterranean Sea that is absolutely stunning and has the most gorgeous sunsets. And they have really beautiful food and are very willing to share their amazing food. And I think that concept of Pezzo optimism comes up really clearly when you talk to them about illness, death, and dying. That on the one hand, death is pervasive and therefore an accepted thing because it is part of their everyday lives. Everybody will have experienced death, whether that's death from cancer or death from warfare and trauma. But at the same time, there's this strong desire to fight against that, to fight against, to keep fighting, because that's what you have to do to survive. So it's complex, but beautiful.
So lovely to get a sense of the people in the place beyond the bad news that we always hear from Gaza and the Middle East. Thank you for taking us there just for a little moment. What's the takeout for Australia as another big question, Rachel? Brace yourself. What's the takeout for Australia? I guess as a society, as a community, but also as a for the palliative care sector. What's the relevance in your research, in your experience for the Australian context?
So I think that there are things that there's a lot that we can learn from other communities and cultures around the world who deal with adversities that we can only imagine and that we only hear on the news. I think we got have had our own little taste of that in the context of the pandemic, in trying to deal with new adversity that we had never faced as a community before, whether that was dealing with lockdowns, with personal protective equipment, with visitor restrictions, not being able to have your whole family around in a hospital setting as somebody was dying. So we in the palliative care world have had to grapple with that, and have had to grapple with this idea that you can't always do everything you were trained to do, that it can't always be perfect. So I think having a sense of humility in that, and understanding that we can always strive to do better and learn from others in contexts of disaster, but also knowing that in those contexts we do the best that we can, and sometimes we have to take part in that. Yeah. I think also we have a lot that we could learn in terms of emergency preparedness planning, that we perhaps haven't been so good at in the past, in healthcare or in the palliative care sector, because we haven't had to face it to a huge extent before. So I think now that we're hopefully in a bit of a pandemic lull, we've got a real opportunity, I think, to be sitting down with our health and social sector colleagues and saying, how do we plan for the next pandemic? And I think that's what humanitarian organisations working in contexts of disaster or war are really good at doing. So how do we as a sector plan better for the next disaster, the next pandemic? I think also we have people in our communities who have come from contexts like Gaza, who have fled war zones, who come from different cultural backgrounds. There's a lot that we could learn from them, and I think, and even learning from our own Indigenous communities on caring for people who are seriously ill or dying, that may be different to the way that we conceive palliative care in our Western biomedical frame. So how do we really embrace cultural diversity and understand the implications that has for palliative care without just paying lip service to it, which I think we sometimes do.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Rachel. And just finally, your research and your travels aren't over yet. In 2022, you were awarded a Fulbright scholarship. You're off to America shortly for further study. Give us a postcard from your travels there. What's the plan?
Yeah, very exciting and very privileged to have received a Fulbright scholarship in not-for-profit leadership that has been funded by Fulbright and the Australian Scholarships Foundation and Perpetual. So I am off to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where they have within their Bloomberg School of Public Health a specialist centre, the Centre for Humanitarian Health. So I'm off to hopefully learn from some amazing people about who are experts in refugee and humanitarian health, and hopefully impart a little bit of my experiences and research with respect to palliative care, which is something that many formal humanitarian organisations around the world have not necessarily thought a huge amount about. So hopefully be doing some good advocacy while I'm there with the team, and thinking about future research opportunities, I think particularly in conflict and disaster settings. So very exciting. It's only about 7 weeks away.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Really appreciate your time. Great to have you at work, not only in our world, but within the Australian palliative care sector and the health sector more broadly. Great to have you at work, sharing your wisdom and sharing your experiences with us. And you're not quite back at work yet. You're only just back from holidays. You've got that beach brain that we can all relate to at summer and trying to get back into the groove of work. So really appreciate you trying to... really appreciate you sharing some time with us today when you've got that beach brain happening and you're not quite back at work yet. You've done beautifully. Thank you so much.
I hope I managed to make sense and haven't left my brain in Bermagui, New South Wales. Thanks so much, Ian.
Thanks, Rachel. Thank you. Thanks, Rachel. And whether you're a listener or a watcher at Thursdays at 3, thank you so much for tuning in and taking an interest. You'll find more information and tools to support your thinking and your own conversations about living well and the end of life on the Palliative Care Australia website. Thanks again. We'll see you next Thursday at 3.